Earthlings. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome to the Animal Rights Show. As you can see, we have a guest panelist who is going to be no surprise to anybody in the sense that you're the actual founder of this show, Jeremy.
I know.
At a minimum of co-founder. Yeah, you've all kept this going. We're about 5 years in now, aren't we?
Is it really?
No.
Is it?
2020, right? COVID, when the start of COVID, wasn't it?
Oh wow, that is a bit scary. Yeah, I was just saying earlier because Mella and I both had some technical trouble, and I said if we weren't here, it would just be like the very origins when it was just you two doing the show. And I remember I used to be in my little Pilates room doing all my weight training, watching you talk about all sorts of stuff, including language, which is of course the theme of today. So yeah,
still figuring stuff out.
Yeah, it feels very familiar today.
Yeah, it does. It's great actually.
So going back in time, let me do a little bit of housekeeping. As ever, folks, if you're watching on any other thing than my YouTube, then that's the best place to see the chat. So if you do comment on Facebook, I will be able to see it, and we'll be able to reply to it. But you won't be able to see anybody else's reply back to you. And then in terms of commenting in general, just go ahead with that. We don't charge for those comments to be put on the screen, so don't you worry. I know you're fretting, people, about that, so don't worry about it. So so we got quite a few in already, including your favorite person from a favorite place. Wendy, if you want to go through
Oh, shall I do the hellos?
Go on then.
So, all right then. Twisted my arm. So we've got number one is Roger Yates. Who's that, Doc? Welcome, Roger. And we've got Carolyn's here. Hey, Carolyn, nice to see you. We've got Keystone Eon. Keystone, I don't recognise your name. Are you new to this show? Well, it's lovely to have you here. We've got Linda Carroll. Hey, Linda. We've got Kristen Hess. Hey, Kristen, nice to see you here. And of course, we've got Philip Murphy from New York. Sorry, Philip. Sorry. And we have the spiritual vegan. Hey there, Jennifer. How you doing? Good to see everyone. I hope I don't miss anyone.
When your New York is getting worse and worse now.
I know it is. It's really bad. It's not improving with time, that is it? It's really not. But never mind.
It's getting to be a bit of a caricature of itself.
I think that's what it is. You're absolutely spot on.
And also Alison Hess. There's a name.
Oh, hey, Alison.
Yeah. So
the whole Hess clan's here.
You got the family here. Great to see everyone.
Very supportive. Great to see.
Absolutely. Right. I suppose we better start doing something then, since everybody's starting to pile in and all that. So we've got 14 live, and then we've got one on YouTube. One on Facebook. So they're all coming in. So we're going to talk about your sanctuary first, Jeremy, because you're just about to receive some main residents, as I understand it, and I also believe you have a little presentation about it. Is that right?
I do. Presentation covers both language and our new microsanctuary, so really only about 10 or 15 minutes. I really enjoy the interactive side of these discussions, so my goal with that is just kind of give us some catalysts to talk about, and yeah, let it roll from there. So happy to dive right in, or whatever you'd like.
Yeah. We'll probably interrupt you on the way through, so don't worry about it.
I'll look forward to it. All right. Well, I will go ahead and get started in that case. So thank you everyone for joining. Just connecting with fellow animal advocates always charges me up, and hopefully you find the same. And I've certainly enjoyed the community that the Animal Rights Show has built and is continuing to build. And for a moment, I'd just like you to imagine you're in a beautiful park nearby, fresh air on your face, you really need to recharge, you're visiting a friend, and you're looking forward to some downtime, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, are you still doing that vegan thing? veganism comes up, animal rights comes up. I think we've all been in this situation, and I guess first we have to decide whether we're going to engage or not. But if we do choose to engage, the next question is, what are we going to say? And I think we have various expectations around this, and please don't be too intimidated by my artwork here, but I think from an expectation perspective, we oftentimes have various intentions, the thoughts in our head, and we use these to craft our message. And the hope is that the recipient or the audience interprets the message exactly as we send it, is thinking the exact same thing as us. We all sing Kumbaya, it's a peaceful world, and everything's solved. But I think we know this isn't reality. Reality is usually we have an intention, we send our message, and oftentimes there's 4, 5, maybe more potential interpretations the audience might have. And from an animal advocacy perspective, those are oftentimes speciesist interpretations. So it's the whole idea behind this is to ponder what those potential interpretations are. So using common movement language, I think most, if not all of us here would agree that all animal use is cruel. And this is common movement language, and so we might ask the question, are you against animal cruelty? Again, we might hope the person says, I am against animal cruelty, I should go vegan. But I think we know this isn't the case. They might say, oh yeah, I support the RSPCA, I do meat-free, so-called meat-free Mondays, or, talk about cruelty to dogs or very specific species, or, something around the lines of I only buy, quote-unquote, humane eggs, meat, dairy, all this stuff. Or, I know where I shop and there's no cruelty there. So comparing that first example with another one, if we were to focus on all of animal use, we might ask the question, do you think it's using our fellow animals is morally wrong? Now, again, the perfect response might be, what, you're right, we should oppose all animal use. But again, we're probably going to be challenged on these topics. People might say, no, but I support some kinds of, animal use, or maybe there's certain types of animal use they think is necessary, or it's only the cruel forms of animal use, quote unquote, that I'm opposed to. And between these two examples, the whole idea isn't that there's one perfect way to do things, but I think in the first example, we're much more likely to have a treatment-based discussion, and in the second example, even if people oppose us, it's much more likely to be centered around overall animal use. So you might be thinking at this point, Jeremy, there's so much to think about as an animal advocate. I can't do one more thing. I just want to use the words I want to use in my language. And you're right, there's a lot to think about as an animal advocate. So I'd like to share a few big picture concepts that help filter all of our language through, rather than completely rewriting the whole dictionaries in our head. And because if there's a few things that we can do to improve our advocacy, such as language, the response to that I have is, why not at least try? And one of the big things I try to do with all of my advocacy and language specifically is center our fellow animals. And a simple example of this is rather than talking about, I'm vegan, saying, yes, I'm an advocate for our fellow animals. Because I think we can talk about this later maybe, but the vegan language has often shifted more towards the human-centric, a human who is vegan, rather than the underlying philosophy, which I guess is a discussion we can have with our audience too. Another key concept, which if you take nothing else from these slides, let it be this that you take home with you, is the flip it to test it method. Hopefully a few of you are already familiar with this, but if there's language that is specifically referring to our fellow animals, if we flip that and think if we're referring to humans, and I think even more powerful, minoritized group of humans, would we use the same language? And if the answer is no, there's probably a strong chance that there's better language we could be using for our fellow animals. For example, this is commonly referred to as, quote, fish. Now, if we looked at a community of them, some people might use that language, and using the flip it to test it method, if we looked at these individuals in a field, we're not likely to say, oh, there's human. We'd say they're humans with an S at the end, gesturing at the fact that it's a group of individuals, which is the same with the fish friends who a lot of us have grown to understand and respect. And that's just one quick example of how that flip it to test it method can work, but there's many others. And the last key thing I use throughout all my language advocacy is quote marks. Those of you in the you'll see it today. My fingers will probably get worn out with the air quotes. But whether it's spoken, written, it's one of the most powerful things I think we can do is putting things in quotes. Rather than just talking about farming, if it's spoken, saying so-called or quote-unquote farming, or just written, just putting quotes around it, because this, unless we're talking about plants, if we're talking about individuals, this is a euphemism for a lot of different actions wrapped up in this. So that's a few of the big pictures ideas. So what I'd like to do now is run through some specific examples, because for those of you, whether you're new to language or maybe you've been thinking about this for a while, I think it helps to kind of go through specifics. So let's get specific.
Just a point of order, Jeremy, that's the Atlantic, isn't it? Isn't that the Atlantic, not specific?
I don't know, it's not that Pacific.
All right, okay.
So the idea with these is not to memorize them, but really thinking about the underlying idea behind why an alternative might be considered, just to help us in our own advocacy and our own linguistic decision making. So we're all, I think a lot of us are familiar with the it language and referring to fellow animals as they, he, she, or I think even better by their name, assuming they have one. Similarly referring to them as someone versus something. And as you've noticed through this discussion, one of my favorites is our fellow animals. I also like to talk about them as individuals. Other animals is used quite often, but I think other animals is quite neutral personally. You know, if we were advocating for a human group, we wouldn't just talk about them being another human. We might talk about them being our fellow human. So I think this just gestures it a bit more there, especially the fact that humans are animals, and building conversations from there. And we have, you know, rather than wild animals, free-living animals, to gesture at the fact that they don't need to be tamed, presumably by humans. And also for those of you who care for dogs, cats, and others, you know, the ownership language, you know, you go out and you go to the so-called vet and you're filling out the forms asking who their owner is. I imagine a lot of us have done that, and really just trying to, again, refer to them by name, and or maybe our dog family, and taking the focus off them as a species and really highlighting the individuals, what I try to do through a lot of this. And we talked about that cruel example earlier, and I suspect the Q&A we can explore this even further, but similar language to cruelty: abuse, suffering, so-called welfare, and dare I say exploitation, I do think have the, at least if we look at the beginning, all those potential interpretations, I think all of this language has the potential to shift towards a treatment-based interpretation. So that's why I like to focus on animal use, and perhaps a bit stronger is attaching the moral atrocities surrounding animal use, and also murder, and more objective language such as this that is hopefully going to lead people towards an objective conversation about animal use. I do talk about breeding language. I think in general we need to talk about this more as a movement, because that's where the problems begin. Because if these individuals aren't created, you know, their treatment, their murder, and all these things down the line aren't really a factor. But I do like to say manipulate into having children when the context allows, or back to those quote marks if it doesn't. And, you know, regulated murder and rather than wildlife management. You know, if a human, using the flip it to test approach, if a human was hit by a car, we wouldn't call them roadkill, we'd call them a traffic accident victim. I think we should do the same for our fellow animals. And similarly with the livestock market, you know, talking about a slave auction instead. And similarly, a lot of common terms: meat, beef, pork, making this animal centric and talking about someone's body, someone's milk, someone's eggs, wing, rib, or someone's skin. And that second example, animal product, I think is an interesting one to me, because it's commonly used by vegans, isn't it? But if our whole goal is to dismiss or dismantle the idea that our fellow animals are a product, I think the language animal product could actually be unintentionally reinforcing that they're a product. So I personally avoid it myself. Similarly, when it comes to going out to eat, you know, rather than talking about vegan options or vegan diet, I think a lot of us are aware of how veganism has shifted almost exclusively to being interpreted as a diet by many. I like to talk about the dietary aspect of veganism, and more common movement language: love, kindness, compassion. I think there's a place for this language, but I like to ground my advocacy in respect, because we don't necessarily need to love someone to respect them enough not to manipulate them into having children, separating families, murdering them, and so on. And this last one I think is just a bit of a fun one, because oftentimes we refer to society by itself, and I think that it works well to shift the conversation from a human-centric to an animal-centric perspective, to talk about the human aspect of society, to remind ourselves that we're not the only individuals on this planet, which I think humanity can often forget. A few other ones, you know. I
have two questions already. We can
Okay.
keep them for later if you prefer. One is how do you feel about the word guardian for the dogs and cats in our families? And what was the second one? The use of the word flesh. Usually I say I don't eat animals, but flesh doesn't sound too bad to me. I mean, it's a bit shocking, so people pay attention when you say that to the waiter, for example. Um,
Yeah, and that strikes at a key part here, Nella, is the having our language be digestible. Because I know I love to play around with new language, but I have to kind of not rein myself in, but pull myself in sometimes, and say, is a non-vegan audience who's maybe never thought about species as language before going to understand what I'm saying? And I think flesh is an example where they at least know. I've done a lot of alternatives around that aspect, and I quite like just referring to someone's body, when it works, I wouldn't eat someone's body, focusing on the dietary angle again. Guardian wise is a tough one. I think it brings us back to that flip with the test it method. If we had a human roommate, what might we refer to them as? I think Guardian's a lot better than a lot of the alternatives. But I like to think of, the dogs who live with us as just complete equals and try to do that through my language. And while they are dependent on me for care, I don't know. I'd probably default to just saying their names when I could, and species when necessary.
I know. I just thought that what I've done, for example, I was filling a form and I crossed out owner and I wrote guardian because I thought that this was like the closest thing to something better that I could write down.
I like that. I like that. Yeah, and this is a great thing about language. The pursuit never ends. I think when we first start out, there's a few key, not calling other animals is one example, but it just continues to evolve through the years. I know I've been thinking about this for 6, 7, 8 years, something like that. So, yeah, I mean, even crossing them out and putting roommate would be interesting to get some interpretations of that too. I don't know. But yeah, for some of these other examples, I think common language, fishing boat, saying murder boat is really what happens on these vessels. And, rather than aquarium, talking about a water prison, zoo or zoo animal, talking about a prison for our fellow animals or zoo inmates. And I know there's discussions going back a few years, especially around the voiceless language. And while I appreciate this is meant to be more figurative rather than a literal use of the language, going back to those thought bubbles, what is a speciesist audience likely to interpret? And I think one of those would be to think that our fellow animals don't have a voice, which is why I like to say unheard, silenced, or invisibilized is probably my favorite, just to avoid that potential, interpretation. And just wrapping things up, just more general language points. I think rather than using you language, you do this, you do that, talking about we or us, such as in, we were tricked to believe, and then building on to our point. And another one that's common is talking about vegan education, or, we're going to educate you. I think this has potential classist interpretations, but I've been on the street, from the title of the slides shows, I've done over 1,000 interactions on the street, and I think this can oftentimes be interpreted as, what, I don't need educating, what are you going to educate me about? Which is why I like to talk about building awareness, which gets across a similar point. And, similar to, rather than non-vegan, I like the idea of vegan curious to kind of hopefully encourage them to be even more curious. And back to that you language, rather than you should go vegan. One of my favorite opening questions is, have you considered veganism? I can't tell you the number of times I've asked this, and 2-3 minutes goes by where they're exploring how they've considered the topic, and you're giving them a space to do this, and usually a lot of things along the way that we can build off later in the conversation. And just an example of some fun things we can do with language, as you've noticed through this. On YouTube, I identify as Jeremy the Ape, which is just a fun way to remind ourselves that humans are actually apes. Technically, we're great apes, but I like to leave the great part off because I think humans have enough ego as it is without attaching great to the language. But this is just kind of a fun way to remind us that we are all animals. And so that's the main language component, but taking a big step back, I think as animal advocates, it's really helped me over the last 10 years as being vegan to put things in buckets a little bit and focus on the things we can control and the things that we can't control. And unfortunately, a lot of animal use is beyond our control. And Stoicism has really helped articulate that for me. And just through an example, we can't control the weather. These are the things that are beyond our control. If there's going to be a lightning storm, rain, cloud, or maybe sun, it's not like we can just turn a switch and change these things. But what we can do is we can put on a rain jacket, an umbrella, and the language is our umbrella. It's one example of the thing that is within our control. And reminding us to focus on the things that we can change, I think, is a lot better, just if nothing else from a sustainability perspective, to know that we are doing the things that we can. And one fun thing that Roger gestured at earlier in the conversation is our new umbrella. At the beginning of last year, we took off for 7 months in the van you see here, 19-foot converted van. Dexter, Chewy, Nisha, and I, and we toured through the southeastern U.S. looking for our new microsanctuary, and lots of factors to consider. But the big thing is we fell in love with Georgia, which is where I am now, and the big climate was the biggest factor, especially for smaller individuals, so that we don't have those super cold winter nights. But we've been busy ever since. We literally having fencing work. If you hear banging, it's because we have fencing work out here just today. So, which is our last big project, which is very exciting. So we've been doing everything we can do to get ready. And similar to our language, through our sanctuary, we're really going to focus on the individual, which I really think is the power of sanctuary, because so often in our movement, I think we're talking about fellow animals as this distant individual, whereas sanctuaries, they get to do the advocacy for themselves, which I'm very big fan of. And this will be both through in person as well as social media advocacy. But we are looking to do our new intakes here shortly, as well as individuals who are already caring for. We have a whole fish community who we care for. But yeah, if you want to follow us, we're on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, under respectanimalsanctuary.com. And look forward to connecting, because I know there's a lot of animal advocates in the group here today, and I want to connect and hear about what you're doing too. And for those who don't know, a microsanctuary, there's no real strict definition. Typically, it focuses on species who are typically, quote, farmed, as you see in the picture here, chickens, pigs, and others. But really, the whole idea is, with a smaller space, limited time and budget, we can start to take in maybe one individual, maybe a couple, and really help relieve the strain from larger sanctuaries, which, don't get me wrong, larger sanctuaries absolutely play a pivotal role. But I think a lot of us are aware that sanctuaries are mostly at capacity, at least the ones I'm familiar with. So it hopefully just allows us to support more fellow animals, and it's just more accessible because starting a big sanctuary, and especially sustaining a big sanctuary, is not an easy ask. That's where I think the micro sanctuaries can really play a pivotal part in the movement. I think they already are, but especially in the coming years, because it's something that's accessible to most, if not all of us. So that is all I have pre-prepared. It looks like we've got a good chunk of time for an interactive Q&A, which, as I said, is my favorite part. The two key things I'd leave you with is, if you're not already, the Unlearning Species as Language group on Facebook, started by a friend of mine a few years back. Varun is a great place to just share ideas. And it's nice because you can kind of drip feed ideas here and there, which is quite digestible, I found. But also, if you like to do a deep dive to build on a lot of the ideas explored here, on my website, begininteractions.com, I've got a free language document, which has been kind of my amalgamation of language thoughts over the past several years, and I try to update that regularly. So with that, thank you so much for all of you as fellow animal advocates for all you do, and yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, before we move on from Vegan Interactions, I've been asked by the vegan filmmaker Andy Atkinson to say how brilliant he found the website, because he was going to try and do something similar to that, and he thought, well, the best thing to do with my website is just linked to this one on this particular, on a set of topics. And so he wanted me to point that out to you, that he found it really, really good. So that's a good recommendation, folks. That's Andy, who probably a lot of people will be familiar with.
Oh, thanks so much, Andy.
Yeah,
that means a lot.
I have to say, I've been following your Instagram posts, and they are so fun, and so different from other stuff I have seen. And I've started looking out for them. they're really great, and I imagine are going to become even greater when you have your first residents coming in. So it was really nice for people to to tune in and follow the account. And sometimes I go to the respect on my sanctuary account when I feel a bit down about stuff going on in the vegan advocacy world, and I look at the place and I say, look, that's gonna be the home of individuals that are not lucky, that they had a very unfortunate start in life, and they will end up there. And this is all done because of vegans. So it's a positive feeling, a positive vibe.
What could possibly get you down? And Nella, what could possibly get you down within the vegan space? I don't quite understand that. So
we don't have long enough.
So we have management issues to deal with now, because we've obviously got two sets of questions that we want to raise: sanctuary questions and language questions, and we've also got some already in the chat. So, Jeremy, do you want to go through the chat ones first, or should we do sanctuary first and then return to these, or what? Anybody got any thoughts about how to do it?
I think the chat's great, because that's kind of going thick and fast, and we can maybe make it catch up on those, because we'll obviously want to value the ideas of those who join us.
So this was the first one. I started using fellow animals rather than other animals. Conversation with nephew when he referred to a roast he was about to have, and I asked who he was going to eat. And so that's an interesting one. What and the who as well. That's pretty good.
I struggled a lot with which examples to share in that presentation. Even still, it was quite kind of rapid fire, but I could easily go on with hours of examples like that, because the who language is really powerful. And I think that's actually within the animals movement something we often, once people kind of connect on not calling them it, still calling that and which in some context, when who is probably a stronger alternative.
I think Philip's comment here is in relation to your non-vegan and vegan curious. What do you think of pre-vegan?
I've used that myself. I think I've shifted towards thinking of them in my heads as pre-vegans, because I guess if you're on the street and say, oh, you're a pre-vegan, I mean, you'd probably get different reactions, but I think some people might feel like their back's up against the wall. It's like, no, I'm not going to do the vegan thing, So vegan curious kind of invites them in versus kind of telling them where they're going. But I think absolutely, let's try these things. It could work for a lot of audiences.
It can't be as good as carnist, though, can it? You carnist.
I was thinking, what about corpse munchers? My favorite, right?
Oh yeah. That in the 1990s, that was really popular in the movement. Corpse munching.
Yeah. Vegetarian claim, though, right? Corpse munching. I guess same with carnist.
Philip also said about this issue of the term lifestyle. Thinks it's been co-opted, as everything is, of course, within a capitalist system. But what do you think of that?
I've moved away from lifestyle myself, because I think perhaps the strongest point for me is also, if we think of other lifestyles, like it's usually associated with a type of music or maybe fashion. And I don't like to think of my philosophy of my view of our fellow animals as a jacket I might take on, put on and take off. So that's where lifestyle language doesn't really resonate for me. But I think as a broader point, because there's so many language considerations, I like to think of them as kind of primary and secondary language concerns. The primary ones are like not calling our fellow animals it and stuff like that. And then the ones that I'm like, maybe a bad interpretation, but maybe not, those I kind of put in the secondary bucket. So I might put the lifestyle concern in the secondary language concerns bucket, but I'd still probably swerve it myself.
We've got one comment. I'm not quite sure what that is in relation to. What about dehumanizing, de-individualizing, and there's also depersonalizing as well. So I'm not quite sure what that's in relation to.
Yeah, maybe just as a general point, this is a good example of where the Facebook group on learning species languages really helped me, because that was a post there a couple of years ago. And another alternative that was suggested was depersonifying, because it's interesting. If we're talking about dehumanizing a human, what are we actually doing? We're making them a, quote, animal. So that's where dehumanizing, I think, is really language we should at least consider alternatives for. And de-individualizing, I like. I think it's definitely stronger than dehumanizing from a fellow animal perspective.
Yes, right. So should we continue the language bits, or do we want to hear more about the sanctuary? What do you think, Wendy? You've been very quiet today so far. It's not like you.
I'm just... I don't know what you mean, Doc. I'm just enjoying listening. I do like listening as well. I do like listening to people. I thought that was really brilliant presentation, Jeremy. Thank you so much. And it's so good to sort of see all these examples, which I've definitely learnt from and have evolved my own language. And I think you're right in that I think it's something that we do need to keep evolving as we go, and not just think, oh, that's it now, I've done and I've arrived and I'm here, and just keep looking at that all the time. I really love that you highlighted the voiceless thing, because I think I see that a lot from advocates, and I think it comes from a well-meaning place that we call other animals voiceless, but actually I think, it's very much sort of belittling who they are as individuals, and to say that they're voiceless. And I think the alternatives that you gave there are brilliant, saying that they've been silenced and invisibilized, and basically they were not listening is a better way to put things. So I love that. One thing that I'm really interested in, and I know we've kind of touched on this before, and I know Joan Danae in Animal Equality, which is all about language, touches on this briefly, and that is the language that we use around vivisection. And I know that Joan Danae sort of advocates for using vivisection, even though it's a word that many people don't really know what it means and may be lost, and maybe then it's not like an accessible word, but it does kind of show the horror more, or it's more of a kind of onomatopoeic word in terms of it kind of sounds like it's something horrible, whereas when we say animal testing or research, they're very euphemistic kind of words. Do you know what I mean? That, and I don't really like using those words, so I often do put them in the old bunny ears, quote marks, or so-called testing and things like that. But have you any thoughts on this kind of language, particularly of what you'd like to use?
Yeah, I've tried to just have a 6 or 7 things in my head I go through when I'm testing language that I'm not sure about. And one of those is this language I was familiar with before I was vegan or an animal advocate? And vivisection wasn't one of them. So that's where I think, perhaps it's a personality thing, but I like to try to use language that I at least have a rough idea of what the potential interpretations are. And like you said, I mean, if I go back to my, to use the term pre-vegan days, I'm not sure what I would say to, what's vivisection. I mean, there's so many different things people can say. So I think animal testing is a bit neutral and euphemistic. So I mean, maybe an alternative is saying, being bred and murdered through so-called animal testing, or things of that nature. But yeah, I think at a minimum, the quote marks. I mean, I think if advocates want to say vivisection, because it is, I mean, the word does imply something's pretty awful is going on. I can that resonates with me, but I think for me, just because of the ambiguity of potential interpretations, I personally don't use it, but Nell and Roger might have other thoughts too.
I'm thinking experiments, something. That's one.
Yes.
Sorry, Nell.
Yes. I was thinking about that. That usually, because vivisection in Greek, it's very rarely used by the people, not the vivisectors themselves, but. Usually, I say experiments done on other animals or on our fellow animals or on certain species. I use the word experiment, feeling that this brings to mind, not good images, like what kind of experiment can be pleasant or moral or good or whatever. So I think that has a negative connotation, and it is understood by most people.
Yeah, sorry, Roger. One thing that came up the other day on World Day for Animals in Laboratories is like I saw images being distributed on social media which were talking about laboratory animals, and I think that's an important thing to remember, isn't it, as well, is that we don't call other animals by something that we've appointed as a role, like laboratory rat, dairy cow, racehorse and those kinds of things. And I did see animal advocates, and again, it's well intentioned. It doesn't mean that people are doing this on purpose, but I think it's really important that we don't give them a designated role. They're a laboratory animal, and I did see a lot of that on WDIL Day the other day. So I think just to bear in mind, it's an important point as well.
It would kind of highlight the fact that they actually bred to be that, though, aren't they? So it's got a critique built in as well, although I would tend to agree with you that it's best to avoid that.
I used one, and I crossed out the laboratory animals. I crossed out laboratory, and I put for the animals and then I typed underneath used in laboratories, and then where it said end all animal testing, I put testing in quotation marks just to highlight. And then I thought, if anyone actually questions why have you crossed this out, it's a good opportunity to then talk about the language of it, which I think is always a good starting point.
That thing about talking about other animals used in, or our fellow animals used in, is great, because it puts the focus on the word as well, and that's what we want. Because obviously this conversation is in that bit in your presentation, Jeremy, about being digestible. So here's an interesting one. For example, you said that you like to use manipulated to having children, right? Now, I always remember my sister, who was a teacher and also kind of like a senior teaching kind of consultant at one point. She was saying that you've got to use kind of language which, to use kind of a British example, that people who read The Sun could understand, because people can't really understand the language in The Guardian. And I always used to use this example, that I knew somebody who was involved in the movement, who worked for the BBC on Oxford Road in Manchester. And her job was to go through the news scripts and replace all the 3-syllable words, because they knew that wouldn't be understood. So you got laboratory experiments, these ones, but also manipulated. Now, by this thing, that the word manipulated, a lot of people might not know what you mean by that.
And the specific reason behind that is, I know from street conversations, which you all may have had similar, when I've said forced into having children, I've had so-called farmers respond, oh, we don't force them. We just put them in a field together, and those types of responses. That's why I talk about manipulation. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of this is fluid. There's option. Even as we're sitting there, you're talking about animal testing. I'm like, actually, animal experimentation does sound better, because if a human's taking a test, it usually involves a pencil and a piece of paper. And
it's a very long word, though, isn't it? It's a very long word, though. Experimentation is a problem, you see.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I don't know what the everybody in the chat and Nell and Wendy think. I think I would like to think most people know what manipulated would mean, but maybe not. Maybe not. It's probably I think a lot of this stuff could do with a lot more kind of feedback from our audience to know. It's because a lot of it, and that's the hard thing about language. Oftentimes, it's like throwing darts in the dark, and we hope they understand what we're saying. But you're right; if they don't have the meaning of the word to hand, we might completely lose them, especially if they can't get it from the context.
Throwing darts in the dark and hope we hit a carnist.
At the carnist. So I was just
if we hear a noise, we did well.
That sounds like a really good game. Yeah.
Volunteers? Anyone?
Yeah, carnist darts. I wanted to ask you about the bunny rabbit ears that Wendy referred to, and you did too, because I think that would really improve the language that we've got going in the movement. Now, at the moment, trying to alter or improve the movement's language is really a low scheme. We can't really even get past it half the time, and this kind of stuff, and fish and all that. And quite often, animal advocates will use words uncritically, like beef and pork and meat and roadkill, all those kind of things. So even if they were to put those, in bunny rabbit ears, certainly when they're writing it, it would help. It would problematize it. But quite often we will go along with the mainstream use of words, but that is because they're going back to that other thing, that digestibility, saying that we need to use language that people understand. And that's why I've always had people say, There's no point in talking about rights. People don't understand rights, which I disagree with, but everybody understands cruelty. So this is the kind of bit of a knotty kind of language problem then.
Yeah, and I think beyond specific examples, a thing that really helps me is the concept of word pairing. So if we have on one hand the speciesist language and on the other hand the language I'd like to use, you know, and it's maybe not speciesist, but an example of a language I've started to use just within the last couple of years is rather than talking about their killing, talking about their murder. You know, saying, you know, and then they're killed, or as I would like to say, murdered. Then we're using kind of, you know, they can take their pick of which language they want to use to interpret it, but we are interjecting the more kind of progressive language, I would say. But yeah, it's tough, I think, to with the range of potential interpretations. It's a lot of guesswork involved. I don't know if that answers your question, but just from a more general point.
Yeah, I do think we're guessing quite often. That is true.
I think a lot with a lot of this as well. I think it's like you were giving their kind of good examples, Jeremy, but also you were giving kind of generalized concepts in terms, and I think that's important, that if we can have like a generalized concept in our mind, like for example the flip it to test it idea, is that every context is going to be different, and there are different people that we'll be speaking with. Are we speaking with them? Are we writing? Is it a post? Is it a short post with like 4 words in it, or is it a longer written passage? Is it in a play? Is it, you know, all of these things we have to just bear in mind in what the context that we're in as well. But just having these concepts in our mind and just constantly reviewing them and challenging ourselves and playing around with it as well. I think that's the important thing, isn't it? Not to fix on one word, but fix on the idea that we're trying to use our language as a political tool to undermine the status quo and the normalized language of violation and violence and, you know, injustice and oppression. And it's trying to undermine that language. That's the aim, isn't it? Would you agree?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, when I first started thinking about language, I was thinking to myself, you know, there's so many words. Yeah, it looks like Nella maybe dropped off. Hopefully she joins back. But yeah, I think it can be overwhelming, because I think if we take a look, our dictionaries were written by speciesists and human supremacists. So if we just open the dictionary and say, oh, what word should we use? We're starting from a bad place. So that's where those general concepts, and I have 8 or 12 in my language document to just kind of help have an overall filter. So that way, when we are challenged with a specific language idea, we can say, okay, would we use this with other humans? Are we centering our fellow animals and these types of things? Because yeah, especially when you're first starting out, and you know, even in our call when we joined each other before going live today, there's 1 or 2 examples where I was seriously reconsidering my language. So it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, absolutely. Nella's back. Are you okay, Nella? Oh, you're on mute. Nella, you're on mute.
Yes, I've been having connection problems all day, but thankfully they last only a few minutes. So I'm back.
Well, I was joking earlier with the fencing work. They were right at our main electrical box when this started. So I was like, oh, if they hit our electrical line right when the live stream starts, this could get awkward. But I think the good news is I'm still here. So that's a good sign. They probably missed it. So
there's a question in the chat about the word grope from Giles.
Oh, the R word?
No, groped. I think groped or great. Or is that, are you saying groped, Giles, or are you saying the R word as in, yeah, I'm not sure actually. If we, yeah, maybe they're just.
I think Roger's muted.
Yes.
Yeah, this is like a TikTok product. So often the word graped is used.
Oh,
now.
Okay. Instead of the R word, right? Got it.
Yeah,
to
that's
hide
right.
the,
And also,
the algorithm.
being unalived is another one which I really have got difficulty with. But these are kind of TikTok things which are spreading into general conversation.
Hey, got it.
Yeah. So what do you think about using words like great, Jeremy?
I haven't. I'm still. We do have an account on TikTok, which I think is a great place to break out of the so-called vegan bubble, which is possibly a different concept. But I haven't come across that myself. But I think absolutely, and I think similar with YouTube comments, they're definitely filtering out certain words, and that's where people use symbols or different letters to kind of still get their comment through. But I think if people know what this means, and because you're only changing one letter, I think it can be quite a clever way to get our point across without. Otherwise, I mean, the underlying language, I think, as a male, I'm reluctant to use, especially on the street. And I talk about the manipulation of having children and all this stuff, but I think there's definitely a place for it. I think the more we can strip away the euphemisms and talk about the underlying acts, maybe it's also for YouTube filters, it looks like. So yeah, I think
I wonder if Giles actually means though to use the R word as opposed to use the word great, which is the TikTok version. But I think I'm beginning to think that Giles means should we use the R word rather than great.
I think Giles is saying I wasn't sure if we could use the R word.
Yes, exactly. So it doesn't. Yeah. So should we use the R word, though, Jeremy?
Yeah, that's the monetization thing. But we're not monetized, so we've never been monetized. So my YouTube is not monetized, and it never has been. And so it's those people who are monetized that are kind of panicky about the language quite often. So I'm assuming that means that we could use it if we were to want to. But I think most people kind of tend to say the R word, although there's another even worse R word in an ableist sense. So it can get complicated by just using, but then again, we all say the N word, don't we? Because we don't want to say anything else. So,
Yeah.
I use forcibly reproduced because I feel that this is something old people will understand, and forcibly can never be good. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think as an example, my own personal progress through language, which is ongoing. I know during my early outreach, this is probably 2017, I would avoid, slavery or Holocaust language or the R word, specifically the sexual assault version, just because I thought it could act as a distraction in the conversation. And I've actually leaned into some of that more. I think there's a place for slavery language, and as we know from our long-form discussions, Roger, going back probably a couple years now, I have come around on Holocaust language. I specifically like to say the Holocaust of our fellow animals, and it's part of that is it's not so close to saying the Holocaust. So I think it's clearer because I think they deserve focus on what happens.
Yeah, I know you changed your mind on the Holocaust thing. It's difficult for what we talked about 2 years ago when. We've got that ethno-methodological problem of the fact that as soon as that word is mentioned, it gets a capital H attached to it, and that's the problem. So I do appreciate that you try to call it the animal Holocaust, or what you said, the Holocaust of our fellow animals. Now is that what you said? Yeah.
Yep.
So
it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's key part of our claims
that's
making,
being careful. You're basically kind of saying to people, I'm not talking about the Jewish Holocaust. Unfortunately, people will hear the Jewish Holocaust. And so I tend to agree with you that it's legitimate to use that word in relation to what goes on with our fellow animals, especially in terms of the size of what goes on, the amount of individual victims and all this, not that we should be counting, as it were. But it still has that problem. I think slavery is less of a problem because we can say, do you agree that our fellow animals are enslaved? Everybody says yes to that, don't they?
Well,
so
the pushback there is, but you're comparing quote humans to animals, because slavery, a lot of people might think about human slavery first. So it's a similar kind of, it's speciesist lens, but one we have to fight through. Sorry, you're saying, Wendy?
It's tricky.
No, I was just going to say that I use enslaved as opposed to slavery, because I think slavery tends to have those same connotations and the baggage that comes with it as Holocaust. Whereas if you say enslaved, it's more a descriptive word of, you know, and it doesn't tend to, I don't know, I just at the moment prefer saying, if I can put that into the sentence, that our fellow animals are enslaved. But I don't, yeah, there's definitely legitimacy to these, you know, kind of comparisons and things. But
well, I'm curious, as the time ticks away, out of everybody listening, between the four of us and everybody listening, we've got close to 30 animal advocates all together. I'm curious if there's any recent language anybody's come across where they were saying one thing and now they've taken a pause and said, you know what, I think I might try something different. Let us know in the comments, I guess, and we'll highlight some of those, because I think that's quite fun to see what people are working with. I know at the sanctuary here, Common Language is talking about residents, and I like to think of them more as individuals, or even better, I think, as survivors, specifically of speciesism. But that's just one other example.
Is domestication just a nice word for slavery?
Well, and I guess you've got the David Nybert domestication alternative too there, but there's definitely some ripening up there, because that's certainly not a word I heard before I was vegan.
yeah.
No, and you don't hear that within the movement, because it's just too odd, I think, for people in the movement, let alone people outside of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I actually have difficulty saying domestication. Domestication is easier for me now because I've used it so much.
Well, it doesn't pass the 3-syllable test, does it, for the sun, does it?
Definitely not. I think in one of my talks that I gave, I used enslaved and I used coerced as well, because coerced can give connotations of, you know, that kind of manipulating someone into certain behavior. I never use domestication anymore, ever. I just never would say that anymore, for sure.
It's a bit of a euphemism, to Andy's point.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm just looking at the time thinking we haven't got loads of time left. Do we continue with the language stuff, or do we just do a little bit of sanctuary stuff? What do you think, Jeremy? What would you rather do? Because this is such an interesting conversation, and everyone has got so many good points in the chat as well. So
happy to go where the conversation takes us. I know Vegan Colleen has an interesting one in the chat. I might just pop up real quick about the harm versus suffering. And I don't know if others have observed this shifting more from suffering to harm, but I think I would tend to agree that there's similar potential treatment interpretations with harm. You know, we didn't harm them, but we fill in the blank another form of use. You know, I think it's a risk. But yeah, happy to field any questions I'd say whatever is on top of mind. Let's do it.
Yeah, I think harm and suffering is pretty similar, isn't it?
Well, actually, one thing we said we were going to talk about, which we haven't actually yet, and is a language point, is exploitation. So I still have a foot in the exploitation camp, and I have a little foot out of it as well. So I'm not sure. We talked about this in terms of is it kind of a little bit, as in your kind of interpretation, Jeremy, you would say this brings up more of a treatment kind of language, or it kind of veers into that territory, whereas some people think it is a more kind of emotive form of use language. So yeah, I'm still a little bit torn. I sometimes use it, sometimes don't. I'm a bit like, yeah, I'm a bit sort of seesawing on this one at the minute. So, but yeah, please do go ahead and explain your reasons why you don't like it. It'd be really interesting.
I think my biggest thing is, if we look at the flip it to test it in human terms, if we talk about ending someone's exploitation, we don't necessarily mean ending their use, or means that they don't work at all. It just means not exploitation through what they're doing. So that's probably the biggest thing. And as we were having the conversation last week on this topic, if I look at my pre-vegan days, for many years, sadly, I bought the humane eggs and so on. I think if someone asked me, you know, do you think there's exploitation going on here? And I would say, well, no, it says right on the carton, you know, this is humane, cage-free, whatever else. So I do think there's a potential treatment interpretation, which is why I generally swerve it, and thinking that it's not necessarily all use is exploitative. I'm not sure the average non-vegan what they would think, but I know that it is common language. But I think the key thing is that we're asking ourselves these questions regardless of what we choose to do linguistically.
So you were saying that in your pre-vegan days when you were a carnist, you would have
corpse muncher.
Throw those darts.
You you were saying that you would have said that there was no exploitation in free range eggs.
Yeah, I sadly, for 12 years, from started aware with these issues before starting to live vegan, I did vegetarian and pescatarian and bought, quote, cage-free eggs and all this stuff, thinking that I was checking the box. And I wouldn't have, if I went back and asked myself, I don't think I would have said, oh yeah, this is exploitation, but I'm okay with it. I would have said, no, it's no exploitation. I've already taken these steps and I'm not exploiting them anymore. So which I appreciate is not what I would say today, but I think through a non-vegan's eyes, that
would
is a
then
risk.
apply that you would say the same about, back then you would have said the same about the word cruelty, and you'd have said the same about the word abuse, right?
To me, they're quite similar, yeah.
Yeah.
There is an interesting comment by Nisha on the chat, and
co-founder of Respect Animal Sanctuary, by the way.
Yes.
Well done, Nisha.
Blatant advertising.
And I just want to say, usually I use oppression. I prefer. I mean, if I can use oppression, it's the most emotive and the strongest word of all, and it's universally understood. So oppression is. But sometimes, for example, when I'm writing something and I don't want to repeat the same word, for example, I use exploitation in the sense that, in my mind, it has only negative connotations. And looked at a few dictionaries before the show, and the two main definitions I found was use for profit, which cannot be good if we talk about sentient being, but we need to, sentient beings, but we need to discuss the whole sentience thing too. And the other one was immoral use for profit. So, what do you feel?
Like
yeah.
I kind of like those underlying definitions better than the word itself, I'd say. But yeah, I think if we can strip these things down to their objective core, that's what I try to do more often than not. Because I think if we have to go to an etymology or a dictionary or all these other sources, we might be venturing outside of what your average person might interpret it as. So yeah, it's a guessing game. Darts in the dark, right? We just have to try to throw the best
also, that's
darts.
our job, though, too, isn't it? We've got to push the peanut. So it's not as though we're going to stay in their comfort zone, because we wouldn't get anywhere if we did that, would we? So there's got to be a decision compromise. It's a dilemma. I understand it. It's just that I'm a big fan, as you know, of the idea of ripening people up. So you can't just stick with where they are. I've never understood that. We've got to meet them where they are. Well, they're in McDonald's, and they're in the cultural speciesism. So, okay, well, we might meet them there, but we want to move them pretty quick, right? That's the point, isn't it?
I thought you were going to say I'm a big fan of exploitation. I was waiting for that.
Well, I am. If you want, I can bring this up. Now, this is...
You had that ready to go, didn't you?
Yeah. You forced me into it, Jeremy. You see, I mean, we've all been, because we knew we were going to talk about this, we've all been having a quite quick look at definitions, and Nella's been looking at Greek definitions of the word exploitation as well. So now I think this here is saying what the definition is saying what exploitation means. So they're saying that as a verb, it can be used in kind of a non-exploitative way, but usually the verb is applied negatively, especially when applied to people, it says. And obviously we'd have a critique of that. When applied to people, it's always used negatively. And so it starts to mean things like, if you then think, well, who's an exploiter? That's somebody with the power to exploit. Who's exploited? Someone with less power, and maybe without the power not to be exploited. So I think that word is usually interpreted, and that's basically what the dictionary is saying, is usually, but not exclusively, talked about in a negative way. And so in the little thing that I said, it said most often used negatively. And then in relation to people, it said always used negatively. And I think obviously when you look at this from Watson in 45, he's talking about it negatively, and there's no ambiguity, surely.
Well, I guess for me, the fundamental question isn't if a negativity is attached to the word, because I think we could also say there's negativity attached to cruelty or abuse or suffering. But I guess to me, the two main questions are, is the language potentially speciesist, i.e. putting down our fellow animals rather than lifting them up? And does it have potential treatment implications? So, because a lot of the language that I personally don't use, it's not because it's not negative, it's just because I think it might lead people to interpreting things and the conversation going to a place where I feel like I have less chance of steering things towards abolition rather than so-called welfare. That's my thought process, but...
Yeah, I get that, and I try to go with you there, because you're basically getting people to say, if it's not cruel, it's okay. If it's not abusive, it's okay. This is the thoughts of the pre-vegan. If it doesn't involve exploitation, it's okay. So I can see where you're putting them together in that. Yeah, I don't know. It's just...
I think as well...
We've got to say something, right? And so... This
also, it's a long word as well. If we're going back to the short words thing, it's more than 3 syllables. Whereas oppression, I guess, would still be 3 syllables. But I think I kind of started to see where Jeremy was coming from in this, because I think it's going back to that humans and our fellow animals are not afforded the same status in our human societies. So it's when humans are exploited, we can think that they have a baseline of what is understood as their basic inherent rights. And then they're being exploited above that baseline of those rights. Whereas with our fellow animals, there is no baseline. The status is not even afforded there. They're literally considered, so the bottom of the made up hierarchy that we've created. And so exploitation there, but people would still interpret it as being like you're being mistreated, whereas actually it's okay to use our fellow animals, but it's not okay to mistreat them when we're using them. And I think that's where I feel, Jeremy, I kind of see where you're coming from with that, in that we could misinterpret it as mistreating while we're using, rather than the using full stop. But can we just clear up with Giles though? Giles, I really don't want Giles to get the wrong idea about this carnist thing. Giles saying, isn't carnist suggesting veganism is a diet because carnist suggests flesh but ignores leather, etc.? Totally. And we, as a team and panelists, like when we say carnist, we're doing it ironically. Like we don't really like the use of that word. So just to clarify with that, Giles, when we're doing it, we're kind of doing it as a little bit of a joke.
Yeah, we're gently taking the piss out of Melanie Joy. That's what we're doing.
And my favorite part is, could you see the self-reflection just a moment later saying cowskin rather than leather? So there's a good example of saying, common language saying, a good observation there.
Yeah. And that's it. And also I think that's really important that we make that point that we're not here to shame each other as well, like, and call people out and shame each other about, oh, you're using the wrong kind of language and you shouldn't be saying this. And I think we're all in this together, trying to help each other and support each other, and just make suggestions in a respectful way, and just kind of evolve as a movement together without shaming.
I think there's 2 points about that, and I think it's a very important point you've raised. I mean, the first one is that social movements are defined as claims makers. So that means that our language is not just important, it's absolutely crucial to what we do, because the language you use articulates our values. And so therefore we've got to be very careful about it. Now we've got a whole variety of language going on in this movement. If you look at advertising, which is slightly relevant and slightly irrelevant, but with advertising, every little helps and all that. I'm loving it, all that. It's based on an easy to understand idea, which is consistently repeated over and over and over and over again. It's not as though someone like McDonald's or a supermarket has a whole range of slogans which they throw around. They have a certain one which they want to mainly be associated with. Now, we don't have that in our movement, and so I think that we can learn from advertising in that sense, because advertising works. Now, the bit that makes it less relevant is the fact that our slogans are more complicated than every little helps, and so therefore we've got to think carefully. For example, our fellow animals are rights bearers, and the human use of them are a rights violation. Now, that's a slogan which I could get behind, but whether it would work by being repeated enough, which is going back to the ripening up thing, is the question for me.
Well, actually, a shout out to my mom, Kristen Hess, in the group. She helped me come up. I love making my own vegan t-shirts, buy a shirt from Goodwill and then get custom printed. And I don't have one of those with me, but I do on my sanctuary knife. I don't know if we all can see this, but this is a nice short, just respect our fellow animals. To me, that's quite a succinct message. Only 4 words. I guess maybe animals is 3 syllables. Hopefully people can be okay with that. But I agree, not making it too complicated.
But the RSPCA could say that. So it could, again, devolve into treatment. Every word could devolve into treatment if we wanted it to. It's a question of the argument we put with it, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I like to try to think of things in establishing scope through the language of animal use, but then also attaching emotion to it. So I think there's a lot of different ways we can do that, talking about moral atrocities associated with animal use and so on. I think we do have to do both, to your point. We have to make sure the conversation's in the right place and do so powerfully. And it's a difficult dance.
I think I'll stop ranting in a minute because I'm on one. But I think one of the things that we need to do, and I'm always suggesting this to animal advocates who deal with the press, is tell the journalists as much about what we're not, as much about what we are, and as much as about what we don't stand for, as much as what we do. Otherwise, the journalists will get it wrong. They'll think that we're anti-cruelty. Oh, you're a kind of militant version of the RSPCA. No, we've got to explain to them, as we do to society in general, that we're not those things. We're not that. Let's bracket that off. This is what we are. And we're not good at that as a movement, I don't think.
Media is very difficult, and also our audience is so vast, isn't it? So many people could be hearing that message, and with a whole range of potential interpretations. And I think you've all probably had experience with media as well, and just that my approach is less is more, because every little bit we give them they could use. So to your point, Roger, trying to steer them away from those weaker claims, it's difficult.
Yeah. Also, you've got that issue that people will understand what they want to understand from it because of their own preconceptions, their own belief system. They will hear what they already believe in a way. So the fact that speciesism is so normalized and welfareism is so normalized culturally, that's often what they hear, even when we're trying our best to give the animal rights position. It's almost like it's going to be misinterpreted almost no matter what we do, unless we really hammer it home over and over and over and over. But then we're not, as we were talking about the other day, we're not consistent in our messages in order to hammer it home over and over. So we haven't got that repetition because there's so much cruelty, abuse talk out there, which is obviously the welfareist language. So in order to change someone, we have to do it with repeatedly, with authority, with impact. But we're just not doing that very well at the moment, I guess. But
well said.
There's room for improvement.
We'll have to come up with our own slogans.
We will get pushback. Reagan got pushback, but he also put out a consistent rights-based argument. And generally speaking, when you look at his stuff, there are some wobbles towards the end of his life. We know that, but generally speaking, it was pretty consistent, right? And that's what we need. Going back to the claims making thing, it can't be overemphasized, the importance of our language, because this is the vehicle that we're putting out our values to the world with, right? And so we can't be sloppy, otherwise we cause confusion. And I mean, people like Francione would say, well, he does say this is the animal confusion movement, because our language is all over the place. We're a complete mess when it comes to language.
And there's lots of opportunity. That's one of my favorite things about language is all of us, it's accessible to all of us, literally. And we don't have to be, I think it applies to all forms of advocacy. I mean, even ones where it's not person to person, there might be a press release later where the language use is important. But it's literally, we can just be at the shopping at the store, and the language we choose to use in response to someone, maybe we're buying a block of tofu. It's we all have the opportunity to get people thinking, which it's obviously a huge task and very important work we're doing. But I think we can have fun with it and get creative with it. And I figure might as well try. Oh, this is fantastic! Yeah, let's chat,
Yeah.
Andy.
There's an offer you can't refuse, eh?
Yeah, I have a whole playlist of everything I could find on Reagan, actually from the early days of the Animal Rights Show, because it's funny because YouTube's not exactly always the easiest thing to find videos on. So yeah, trying to put those all in one place for future reference. And yeah, I love the work Andy does with enhancing some of these older videos, because I think it makes them a lot more, to go back to the term, digestible.
Yeah, well done, Andy.
Yeah, I guess we have to accept that technology moves, and it's a little bit like getting kids to watch a black and white movie. You kind of can't do it. I just remember Jake Conroy's first video on YouTube. He was trying to tell activists about the language, the history of the movement, and they said, "Well, show us some of it." And he said, "Okay, yeah, it's in these zines," and they were going, "Well, I'm not going to read anything. Show us it on YouTube." And it's not on YouTube. And the response was, in that case, it doesn't exist. It didn't happen.
That's why the movement started in 2016, isn't it? The animal rights movement began in 2016 or something like that. Is that right?
Somewhere like that.
Around there.
Well, at least we know we all exist because we're on the YouTube, right?
Oh yeah, confirmation.
We do exist.
Yeah, the Animal Rights Show.
It's not
exists.
the Matrix, or maybe it is. Who knows?
Yeah, there's somewhere else in the what do they call it? The multiverse, don't they? There's lots of different versions of the Animal Rights Show. That's spooky, isn't it?
But very, very spooky.
I was thinking from your PowerPoint, and I think the one thing that I like the most is the flip it, test it. I think it's an excellent tool to decide if our language could be better, and can be applied in different languages, because often one word is associated with more negative connotations in one language and with more positive ones in another. So translation is not exactly the same everywhere and in different cultures. So, but the flip it test can be applied everywhere, like in all language. So I find this super useful. And the other thing I was thinking about is that we should not be very hesitant with language. I mean, stopping ourselves from saying something before we need to stop and think, because usually we get more than one try with people. They don't hear just one phrase from us. So even if we don't get that first phrase right, we can always elaborate and get our message across. And that would leave us more room to express our thoughts and correct our language in the process.
Yeah, I've certainly been pleasantly surprised just on trying new language, how receptive people are. And I'm discussing, I'm thinking of, non-vegan or vegan curious audience here. I mean, as simple as ordering a coffee, rather than talking about vegan milk, talking about animal-free milk, making it more fellow animal-centric. And the concept of mirroring, people will say the same language we use back to us. And I've had that happen with that example with animal-free milk. And I'm fairly confident that person's never talked about animal-free milk in the past, but that's how we can kind of work this new language into the conversation. So yeah, absolutely. Like as advocates, we have to kind of be, well, I guess we're brave in the first place, taking up the role, but we have to continue to be brave through our advocacy.
Here's a question that has just occurred to me, Jeremy. You've done lots and lots of hours of street work. How do you think modern day activists would fare if the screens went off and they had nothing to point to and they had to actually make the case for animal rights with their mouths, as it were, rather than going, look at that, look how cruel that is?
It would be tougher. I mean, I know I use footage on my street outreach, which is a whole nother kind of can of worms to liberate. But because I think there's a lot of potential treatment interpretations when it comes to this, but I think you're right. And I think I would struggle in a lot of ways to get somebody to really connect with the platter or fellow animals without a visual, because people are different types of learners, aren't they? For someone who's a visual learner to try to have a verbal conversation about a complex topic such as this, I think it would be hard. I mean, I think we could still do it. I've had loads of conversations where people are, they look at the screen and they say, oh, I can't watch that. And I kind of say, well, it's okay. We can just chat. You don't have to watch it, and, and go about it that way. But I'd like to think we'd adapt, but who knows?
Also, we have a lot of conversation with people without screens. I mean, when you are in a bar or in a coffee shop or at someone's house, you don't have the footage with you necessarily, or you don't feel it's the appropriate thing to do to show them footage on your phone. We have these conversations anyway.
Good point.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, actually, Nella, that you just raised there, in that we often think of our activism as being like literally when we're out on the street or we're at a demo or we're doing something that we would label as activism. But I spoke about this in a talk last year for Sentient Rights Ireland, that we can consider even our simple conversations as a kind of micro activism, and that if we embody our values as vegans and animal advocates all of the time throughout our day, there are so many opportunities to put in those little tweaks of language, those little trans breakers that are going to like make someone stop and think or ask you a question, and just the way we also behave towards our fellow animals and embodying that respect towards them and setting the example and leading by example and encouraging others to do the same. All of that we can consider being a kind of microactivism, so we don't have to just label the big things that we do activism, and we can do all those things all the time. And I think language is such as Jeremy was saying, such an accessible part of that we can all do all the time in all situations, and just changing things for the context that we're in. So
absolutely important. Yeah, and I think if I could snap my fingers and change one thing, there'd be a few things, but vegan t-shirts, pick your favorite question you'd like to ask people and put it on the back of your t-shirt and go shopping with it. You usually don't even have to have a conversation, but you're getting people thinking. So if every animal advocate and vegan did that, I think we'd start to move, to use Roger's expression, we'd start to move a few peanuts, I'd like to think. But
there are whole activist events that do not rely on footage. Usually I like footage because it's one picture is like 1,000 words. That's true, and you can use the footage to move the conversation faster and everything. That there are whole events that do not include footage. For example, tomorrow in Greece, because of the Orthodox Easter next week, there is a very large activist event that happens, it's the third year, I think, this year, and there is no footage at all, just placards, people, and placards with words or questions, things like, if you think that murdering someone to eat them is wrong, stand by me for a few seconds, and people do that. they read the placard and they stand by you for a few seconds. And I'm sure there are other people that they don't actually come next to you, but you know, they go away thinking about that. So I don't think that that we base our activism so much.
Well, actually, that's a brilliant idea, isn't it? Just stand with me for a little while if you agree. Yeah, that's interesting, that, isn't it? Yeah, I like that.
It's empowering. I could imagine, you know, my pre-vegan days. If I did that, I'd say, "Oh, that felt really good. Maybe I should explore this further." Hopefully.
Yeah, kind of. I did a bit of activism today. Yeah, kind of. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's also at a great venue because it's outside the parliament, so it has like a different vibe. Like it's very visible.
Is that posted on social media, I imagine? What's the best way for people to kind of follow that?
We'll post pictures afterwards and videos of the event, and it's very well attended, so I'm looking forward to it. It's like the only positive thing this week. It's a dreadful week.
Well, we're 20 minutes over the hour, but we knew we would do that. I do have one question. I think we've talked about this before. Well, I've got a couple, but I'll restrict it to this. You said at one point you would use the name of the fellow animal if you knew it, right? And and that was in the presentation. I've always had a problem. And don't take this too serious, folks, because it's not a massive issue for me. It's just that it's always been knocking around in my head for years and years and years about naming other animals, kind of like imposing our name on them. To the extent that I often wonder whether they get together and go, you know, why does Jeremy call me that? You know, my name is, you know, like, I wonder what they would call themselves, as it were. Whereas, you know, yeah. Dexter, you know, Ruja, we've imposed these names, haven't we?
Absolutely.
And yet you think, okay, well, that's respectful, but it's imposing, isn't it? Which is quite interesting.
Yeah, Friend Farmed Animal Sanctuary, a sanctuary who I know closely and love, who I support in the UK. Actually, their early days, they didn't name any of the individuals. They just let them exist, do their thing, and didn't go about that. I think there's different approaches, and I think we're in this awkward human supremacist world that I think attaching a name to someone, it doesn't guarantee they're free from use or oppression, whatever word we want to use, but I think it does at least nudge people towards seeing them as individuals. So it's this difficult dance with, I completely agree, I'd love to live in a world where we didn't give others names. You know, even our names we don't choose, do we? Our parents typically choose them. So yeah, I think it's an imperfect solution to try to get people to connect. I think another topic was sanctuary selfies. I think there's a place for, you just put a human next to a fellow animal, and somehow for non-vegans or vegan curious, they might be more likely to connect with another species just because a human's in frame, because the abstract concept of a pig just seems so distant, but all of a sudden, oh, here's a human ape, you know, sitting next to this pig. Oh, maybe we're not so different after all. And there's these weird psychological things happening that I think are still need to have a lot of study there.
And also, I think
not animal exploitation. Sorry.
With pictures, as you said, Jeremy, especially people that know you on a personal level, when they see you in a picture with one of our fellow animals, you know, they are more likely to think about it, about your connection with this particular individual, and what are you saying about our animals in your life in general. I think for them, is more powerful than the picture of just an individual by themselves.
Yeah, it's a very tricky one, isn't it? And it's like you used a phrase there. I can't remember your phrase, Jeremy, but you said it's an imperfect solution or something. But and I think it's true that all of these situations, none of them are ideal, and it's trying to find somehow the balance between advocating for our fellow animals whilst also respecting them, and like looking at each situation and doing that as best we can. But often the situations are not ideal, and there isn't a perfect answer or solution to it whilst we're living in this world. It's really challenging. because one of the other questions I was going to ask you about the sanctuary, just to say, folks, that I have to jump off quite shortly for Brian. I like to call Brian. He might hate that name, quite frankly. But was about that balance of when you have more residents in your sanctuary, how are you going to navigate the having visitors maybe taking a tour around the sanctuary? I know a lot of sanctuaries do raise funds by having tours and taking visitors around to meet the residents. But then we also have to remember that they are refugees from industries of violation. This is their home. We also don't want to make it, like a zoo, for example, a prison for other animals, because what's the difference if we have these other animals and they are in a captive situation? At the end of the day, this is the reality. They are in a captive situation, even in a sanctuary. But what's the difference if we're bringing visitors around a sanctuary to meet and greet the residents? How do we then differentiate that between how the so-called zoos bring other people in to raise money to view the residents there? So it's kind of, it's difficult territory. And I just wondered, how you are going to navigate that one.
Yeah, I think, the first point you just got me thinking. I wonder if when Brian hears his name, he said he associates it with getting his medication. So it might not like his name very much at all. But yeah, I think to your point around tours, I think one of the benefits of being a smaller setup is everything we do would be supervised. We wouldn't kind of send people out to do what they will. But I think the key thing for me, and I learned this early days actually before I started working with vegan sanctuaries and some of work with SPCA and dogs, actually this is going back 12 plus years, is to meet fellow animals on their terms. So I always like to kneel down, make myself small, even turn myself away from them and turn my back to them. I find works quite well. But the key thing is letting them approach me. I think it's very difficult to get consent when we're talking of someone of a different species, because we very often don't speak the same language. But at least if they can approach us, there's some level of saying, hey, I'm okay with this interaction. And I think that's where we would differentiate ourselves from, the typical zoo setup. And that's a whole, the so-called zoo, or as I said earlier, the fellow animal prison, that's, lots of differences and key things to watch for there. But it's tricky, isn't it? Because people misuse the sanctuary language. People claim they're a sanctuary and they travel around to, show their animals and all this stuff. So, and I think as we scale up with larger sanctuaries, it becomes more and more difficult. But I think to your point, Wendy, as long as we consider things from our fellow animals' perspectives, hopefully we're at least moving more towards, a sanctuary versus a so-called zoo.
Yeah. No, definitely. Really important.
I like the idea of sitting down and turning away, and probably, a couple of cows have a little word and say, I tell you what, I'll go and comfort the small ugly one over there.
That explains it. I was always wondering why they're so friendly.
It works with dogs as well sometimes. Like when I've been out in parks and out in fields and things, and there've been groups of dogs that are with humans. Sometimes while the humans are away chatting, I'll be the one crouching down, looking away, and suddenly all the dogs come over to me, and they're all kind of, interested in me, sniffing me, and then sitting and just kind of by me. And then if all the humans look over as if to say like, how come all the dogs are over there by her? But I think it's because I'm doing just that. I'm not a threat to them. I'm not standing over them. I'm not trying to impose myself and force myself to, strokes onto them and things. And I'll just sit and be quiet. And it does really seem to work, that actually, because you're not threatening and imposing yourself. So that's a really good one, I think.
Oh, and I think they can sense our energy too. Like Deb was saying in her talk on Sentient Rights Island a few days ago, she was saying if she has a down day, the horses and the dogs and others, can sense it. So I'm sure, in addition to your posturing, they know you're not kind of thinking about doing something menacing towards them. So absolutely.
Yeah, I think we do tend to forget that our fellow animals or other animals have got much greater smell sense than we have. They get
body language.
A lot. Yeah. And I think Benny Malone was talking about the research that had been done into the way that chickens see the world. and it's very, very complicated. In fact, there was an early film that I was involved in about 12 years ago, where we looked at the way that if you look at some flowers, a chicken will apparently get a really vivid, radiant vision compared with us, which often allows them to pick out little bits that we wouldn't see. You know, like if you see, you know, like a vat of corn or something, they would be able to pick out the good bits quicker than we would even see them, or not even see them at all, because their sight is much better than ours, in the same way as a lot of them can smell much better than ours.
Yeah, and I guess we were talking before we hopped on, weren't we? Anytime fellow animal advocates refer to you know, quote, research, you know, how is that research done, and are we actually potentially reinforcing said research? You know, even though there might be a positive claim to be made from it, you know, it's like, all right, how did they, you know, so that test the chicken's vision? You know, it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I know that was always a problem, in the sense that, you know, cognitive ethology, you know, still experimenting on them, but not in a kind of invasive way, but they've still got them in their contraptions and all the rest of it. So yeah, you're right. You know. Yeah, so that's the thing about the smell. Come on, Wendy, you can do it. My dog has got no nose.
How does he smell?
Terrible.
The old cracker jokes are the best, aren't they? Okay.
Yeah. They're dad jokes. If that didn't shut the show down, nothing will.
I'm cracking up over here.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for all the appreciation in the chat, and it's like
it's the tumbleweed, isn't it, going by?
Yeah,
it must be that 10-second delay, right?
10-hour delay. Right. Well, if you're not going to appreciate my jokes, I'm off.
That's the best, is it?
He's just warming up. He's here all night.
It's been an absolute blast, as we knew it would be. So thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Before we say goodbye, Jeremy, could you please how people can locate the sanctuary on social media? Under what's
just
the
respectanimalsanctuary.com, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. That'd be great. We look forward to connecting with everyone. We've got a lot of exciting years as we're setting up here coming up soon.
Fabulous, and good luck with it all, Jeremy. I'm sure it's going to be an amazing place for our fellow animals. And thank you for all the work that you're doing, and to Nisha as well.
Another thank you to Jeremy from everybody, I'm sure, and thanks for everybody who stuck with us. Do smash a like for us on YouTube, and we shall see you again fairly soon. So bye for now.
Hi everyone.